Well, good afternoon again from all of the different time zones. Good morning as well. I'm really excited to welcome you to our first talk in our new Center for AIDS Research Implementation Science course series. This series in general will bring together leading scholars and practitioners, and our hope is to share cutting edge methods and strategies for advancing implementation science in real world settings. And today we are thrilled and honored to kick us off and to have Dr. Alison Hamilton with us. Dr. Hamilton serves as the Implementation Research Director for the C ship and is the corresponding PI of several major initiatives, including the Empower 2.0 Query Program and the Query Evidence-Based Quality Improvement Implementation Strategy Training Hub. Her leadership extends across multiple national and international efforts, from directing the VA Women's Improvement Network and the HSR Women's Health Research Network, to also being a founding member of the VA Anthropologists Collaborative and the Society for Implementation Research Collaboration, or CIRC. She also holds academic appointments as a professor in residence at UCLA and an honorary professor at the University of Cape Town. Her editorial contributions span many journals, and today she will be sharing her expertise in using rapid qualitative analysis in implementation research. She'll offer practical insights into this method that is increasingly important for translating evidence into action efficiently and effectively. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hamilton, and I will have her take over from here.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Really appreciate the great turnout and this opportunity. And I didn't know I was kicking off your series, so super honored to be here with you all today and share a quick version of this topic. I'm going to try to get through everything I have in mind, but I also do want to hear your questions and comments. So I'll be keeping an eye on the chat as well. Um, and then there may be things that I end up sharing with you afterwards, depending on what you're interested in and thinking about. So let me just get set up here. Okay, is that looking good on your side, Sarah?
Yes,
I,
it looks good.
yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So, just thank you for the kind introduction. I know you heard that I'm in the Department of Psychiatry at UCLA, but I am an anthropologist, not a psychiatrist, and have been doing implementation science for a very long time, between VA and UCLA. And in fact, this approach really came out of implementation research that I was doing back in the early 2000s, where we were doing what became known as a hybrid type 2 project, but that language wasn't even really around nearly as much as it is now. And I was realizing at the time, as the only qualitative person on the team, all of these things have changed over the past couple of decades, but as the only person on the team doing the qualitative work, I realized that my usual techniques of working on the data were not really meeting the demands of the project. And so I started to develop other ways to work with data. I mean, it's come to be used in many other fields besides implementation research, but since this is an implementation audience, I will share that piece of information with you because it really was very motivated by the inadequacies of my usual ways of working with data in the context of more rapid turnaround phases of implementation research. So, what I want to do today in our brief time together is give a quick rationale for tailoring methods in implementation projects and go over some design and analysis considerations, and then I'll walk you through the approach using an example from a 1 year implementation project, and I'll wrap up by talking about a few limitations of the approach and just one example of comparing rapid to the way that I'm going to share it with you compared to a more framework-driven approach. And then I have an example at the end that I may or may not get to, but I'll keep it in the slides for you in case we don't get to it. So I am, I'm trained as an anthropologist. I'm a very applied and pragmatic person. And I've been straddling the sort of academia, non-academia worlds for a very long time and have always been really excited to figure out how and where and when qualitative methods can be used across many different purposes and audiences. And so I'm driven by this question of how we can do this work in compelling, rigorous, efficient, and impactful ways. We may not always try to hit those in some types of work that we do, but certainly in implementation research, we are trying to, produce useful research findings to translate our findings into practice. And I do think a lot about audience and stakeholders. This is an older quote, and language is veering away from that term. But in the quote, it's about engaging stakeholders in the relevance of research. And I think as this audience knows, being an implementation audience, we have a wide variety of constituents in our work, and it's really up to us to transmit what we're learning from our data in ways that make sense to the people for whom it was intended. So it's not an academic exercise. That may be part of it, but there's often a really practical use for the data that we're collecting, and we need to share it in ways that are going to be helpful, to put it in a simplified version. Rapid techniques in qualitative methods have been around a long time. I definitely did not invent them. I think historically, a lot of the more rapid work was done in the context of things like public health emergencies, environmental crises, etc. James Beebe wrote a book back in 2001 about rapid assessment process, where he talks about an approach that uses team-based qualitative inquiry with triangulation, iterative data analysis, and additional data collection to develop a preliminary understanding of a situation from the insider's perspective. And that actually works pretty well for what we do in implementation research. We don't want to lose the spirit of qualitative inquiry, even when we're doing things quickly. We do need to be iterative. We often need multiple forms of data, and we want to have the right expectations of what we're getting given the rapid turnaround timeline. He defined rapid as a minimum of 4 days, a maximum of 6 weeks. I tend to, especially thinking about implementation research, I tend to think about the phases that we use for our work. So if we think about like pre-implementation, implementation, sustainment, or whatever particular framework you might be using, each phase in and of itself might be, 8 months, 10 months, 12 months. And often we need to turn things around in the context of those phases. So it might not be one project that lasts a year, it might be a project that lasts 5 years, but then within that, there are multiple phases. But even when we're doing rapid work, we don't want to do the work in a rushed manner, and we want to make sure to maintain rigor and, again, that spirit of qualitative inquiry. So there are unique features of more rapid turnaround qualitative methods. The approach is much more telescoped and action oriented, and there is that pragmatic need for qualitative data. So maybe we need to describe the environment where something is going to happen, or the process that's going on while we're implementing or others are implementing an intervention. We may need to describe usual services or practices in order to compare and contrast to what we have introduced via implementation, research and practice. Typically, this work is, and ideally, it is conducted by teams. That helps to make it go more quickly when you have more people working on it. Not that you can't do it alone, but hopefully we can do it in teams because that makes the work better and stronger and richer. We're often drawing data from multiple sources and doing mixed methods work, so triangulating with quantitative data, maybe doing some integrated mixed methods work, and there are trade-offs. So I'm a believer in finding the right tools for the job, not having allegiance to one particular tool or way of doing things. And every tool has its sort of limitations and parameters. And what can happen with Rapid is that they're especially because you are trying to turn at least that preliminary understanding around relatively quickly, you may not have as much time in the moment to critique, to reflect, to synthesize those things that sort of characterize qualitative methods historically, and are very important aspects of what we do with qualitative methods, but might not fit as extensively as we would want given the demands that are on the work that we're doing within the context of that rapid turnaround timeline. This does not mean that you can't ever critique, reflect, synthesize. It just might not happen in the 6 months that you have to collect data and turn around some preliminary results. So, because I've been around for a long time, I have had opportunities to develop qualitative methods in implementation research with many colleagues. And several years ago, when there was just a handful of us doing this work, we were meeting up at conferences and, talking whenever we could about how to tailor methods for this type of work. And we ended up forming a group affectionately called QualRIS, Qualitative Research and Implementation Science, which resulted in a white paper that's available, hosted gratefully by the National Cancer Institute. It's still there last time I checked. So you can find it at that link. And what we wanted to do in this white paper was identify what's different about using qualitative methods in implementation research, which you see on the left. That's just a quick summary of 9 key features in this type of work. And then also identify some need and opportunities for innovation, which you see on the right. And one of those is to strengthen tools and techniques for rapid qualitative assessment and analysis. This was in about 2018 that the white paper came out. There's so much evolving and emerging all the time, which is extremely exciting because I think what we find, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, what we find as we continue to innovate in implementation research as we continue to innovate in the methods that we're using. And so there's many, many developments with all of our methods, our study designs, the ways that we think about things, the way that we do things. And that is really exciting and the sign of a maturing field. So I perhaps don't need to clarify too much about why we would study implementation processes qualitatively to this audience. So just super briefly, of course, we need to describe how people are engaging with each other, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means. We need to explain processes because they vary even from one person to the next and their perceptions of what's happening. We need people to explain to us what they see happening or what they anticipate happening, how they reflect on processes. We also know that processes, relationships, contexts are quite fluid and dynamic and hard to measure. And so oftentimes we want to measure what we can, and we also want qualitative data to speak to the things that are less amenable to measurement, and then put those together to develop that fuller picture of what's going on. And we also know in implementation that perceptions are very key to everything we do. We may think one thing about what's going to happen with an evidence-based practice, but the people who are being tasked with adopting it, adapting it, et cetera, are potentially thinking quite differently about it. And we need to understand that in order to provide support, maybe adjust our own ways of thinking and try to achieve our goals within the implementation effort. So this is not super specific to implementation research in terms of choosing our qualitative methods. We need to do this in all types of research, think about how we're selecting methods and the complexity of those methods. But there are aspects of this that are particularly important to consider in implementation research in terms of being strategic about what methods you're using. And I'll talk about this more in a moment, and your sampling approach, and also this idea of data sufficiency. So one thing that my colleagues and I are working on, particularly Erin Finley, and she and I wrote a companion piece to that white paper that's in the psychiatry research, which is cited below here. So she's really my partner in thinking about and advancing qualitative methods in whatever ways we can. Um, we're really working on an alternative to saturation with thinking about data sufficiency in implementation research, with the idea that we often collect more data than we need, um, and then we don't do anything with it. We're not trying to necessarily
Allison, I'm sorry. I think you just muted yourself. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no problem. I don't know how that happened. I didn't even touch anything. Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. Um, so we want to think about strategically what data do we need from whom and how much data do we need to accomplish our goals. We also need to think about when we will analyze the data, and that is really where Rapid came in because depending on the design, we might be analyzing data during the course of the implementation project, and needing to turn it around while we're still actively conducting the research, for example, in a hybrid type 2 project where we're going to potentially use qualitative data, maybe mixed methods data to inform, for example, what happens with our implementation strategies or what happens with adapting an intervention. So that means we can't take 2, 3 years to analyze the data, but we have to have a plan for that analysis approach from the very beginning because it requires a lot of intentionality. Otherwise, it will become very hard to kind of fit in all the different things that need to happen during this very, very busy and active type of research. So I really like to think about, I think yeah, I like to think about qualitative methods on a spectrum. So we're going back briefly to data collection because this has a lot to do with how Rapid works. So if we think about qualitative methods on a spectrum, we can collect everything from unstructured qualitative data, which is what I was trained in as an anthropologist, all the way to structured qualitative data. And if we were to draw this line out to the right, we would be getting into quantitative data. So it's all a spectrum from my perspective in terms of our methods options. Historically, and I'd say still to this day, we mainly rely on semi-structured methods in implementation evaluations. Um, there's more work that's emerging toward that more unstructured side of the spectrum. If we think about ethnography, that can really cover the entire spectrum and can extend into quantitative data as well. And several of us are working on how to use more ethnographically informed methods in implementation evaluations as well. So I think we're seeing emergence toward the incorporation of at least some less structured data collection efforts, because of course that means that we're more sort of open and inductive to what might be going on that we wouldn't otherwise see, or that is not within our frame of reference, especially as that frame of reference might be driven by a theory model framework or more than one. We can even think about in our qualitative data collection using some elements of some structured data collection, which can really help with rapid turnaround. But what you'll see in this approach that I'm sharing with you today and in other similar approaches is a lot of use of templates. So we want to kind of get organized according to some key domains and use that as a way to process through the data more quickly so that we can turn around the findings that we're interested in using. Really, there is that practical application. So I'll get into the approach now. I know I'm going kind of quickly, but I just these things go very fast in an hour, so I want to make sure to show you what this is about. I started presenting this and teaching around like 2012, 2013. There are a couple of cyber seminars that I did for VA, which are not currently accessible by people without a VA email, I'm sorry to say, but I just heard yesterday that that's going to be opening back up. So hopefully these are still available, although you're getting a more current version of this now anyway. And then there's a longer version of the talk I'm giving today on a YouTube playlist that I have for my implementation science training hub, and that link is the last one that you see there. So when we think about our rapid projects, there are some key ingredients. And again, rapid projects meaning even a longer project that has rapid phases. So we want this combination, so really critical combination of specific and targeted questions, a team that's prepared and trained to do the work, a feasible data collection and analysis approach, and specific and targeted products. And this is all in the context of the timeline that we have for the given project. So what we like to do in more rapid turnaround projects is ensure that we're tying the analytic techniques that we're using to what we're using them for. Um, so that means that in many cases with this type of work, the immediate goal or targeted product is not an academic paper, which could take a lot longer to produce. It might be a report, it might be an executive summary, it might be a quick presentation. Summaries of summaries, as you'll see, are very common in this type of work. And so we want to make sure that the energy and investment that we're putting into data collection analysis is very clearly tied to what we're trying to get out of it within a given time frame. Does not mean that you can't do other products, given more time or after you've achieved certain goals or benchmarks, but being really clear within the timeline that you have, what are you trying to produce? So I showed you the spectrum a moment ago, and I bring it back here just to show you that rapid analysis fits in that center to the veering to the right side of the spectrum where we're collecting data about people's knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs, their expectations about a given phenomenon. We're using semi-structured data collection, which is what fits with rapid analysis. And the choices that we have for analysis are very much shaped by the choices that we make with our data collection methods. Um, you'll see on the left side for unstructured data collection, it is not a good fit for rapid. There are many other analytic techniques that are going to work better for unstructured data collection. And this is a really key takeaway for today is that fit between the type of data that you have or the types of data that you have and the analytic approach that's going to work well for that type of data. So this is very much an approach that is geared toward data that has some structure involved. Doesn't have to be totally structured, but it has some structure, and I'll explain that through my example. So there is a context for this approach. It's an approach that my colleagues and I have been developing for over 20 years called sort and sift, think and shift. And one of our papers is cited there. And what we've found, having helped many, many hundreds of people with qualitative work, is that people often get stuck in a particular paradigm, or they get stuck with coding, and don't really know how to move forward, how to get what they want from the data, because they might feel like there's a right and a wrong way to do things, and a particular prescription for ways of working with data. And that can be frustrating. So we've really tried to develop something that is more open and fluid and influenced by a whole range of different paradigms and philosophical traditions. It draws on grounded theory, phenomenology, content analysis, like you name it. We bring in elements of those traditions into this approach, which is really reflected by a synergistic relationship between diving into the data and stepping back from it. So part of the diving in process is really document what we have available in the data. And that's where Rapid comes in. So what we want to do is create basically an inventory of the data contents to answer this question of what's in the data. The question for a lot of the Rapid approach is not what are the data about. It's not a highly interpretive process. It's really just trying to get an accurate accounting of what did people say that's going to inform what we want to do. And this process can very much be organized by the constructs that we get from our theories, models, and frameworks. So it's a systematic approach to developing an inventory, and we're creating basically summaries of our data collection episodes, meaning our interviews, focus groups, observations, so that we can have more accessibility to what's in the data, and especially in implementation research, to focus on what is actionable or informative for our next steps. And I think this will all make sense when I give you an example. So the steps are here. I'm going to walk you through these, but I just like to put them on one slide so you have everything in one place. And I do want to emphasize here that this is a very tailorable process. So even though it's laid out in steps, that's really just to hopefully make it really clear as I walk you through it, but not to feel like I have to do exactly what Alison said, exactly the way she said it. It can be very much tailored according to your team, your goals, the knowledge base of your team members, etc. So there are some things that are not that I don't recommend tailoring, and I'll point those out. But for the most part, this is all very, very flexible and has been done in many, many different ways. And I'll show you a comparison a little bit later. So the example that I'm going to just walk you through briefly is a project that my colleague Donna Washington and I did many years ago. We had a year, and the problem was that homelessness, risk for homelessness, was not being identified early enough to be able to potentially prevent it, or at least prevent multiple cycles in and out of homelessness. This was among women veterans, and we referred to it as homelessness vulnerability. So we wanted to create a tool that would help to screen for vulnerability earlier than the mandated screen that was in the system, which was meant to detect imminent risk of homelessness, like within a month. We wanted a tool that would detect this vulnerability earlier, again, so we could try to get women to services before they became homeless. We were piloting implementation in one healthcare system. This was many years ago, so we were using the first version of the consolidated framework for implementation research, not the latest version. And what we wanted to do was collect data about knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs related to screening for homelessness, refine the tool based on this feedback, try it out, test it, revise it based on what we learned, and then do another cycle. So we did 2 cycles of the data collection and refinement. And you'll see that our products were not academic. They were reports on processes, responses to the intervention, developing implementation strategies. There was a lot that we needed to get out of this that wasn't about publishing a paper. So we had multiple different activities, and you just see the data sources that we used during each phase of the project, and why we use these different data sources, and the fact that we repeated our data collection to continue to refine the tool. So just briefly to think about interview guides, because this is going to have a lot to do with rapid analysis. And there's a whole other topic that we could spend a long time on, and I'm going to give you a link to the bigger playlist on YouTube that has a whole workshop on designing interview guides and implementation research. But what you see here is the way that we designed part of the interview guide. This isn't quite the whole thing, according to the intervention characteristics domain within CFAR. So we took each of the constructs in the old CFAR and designed questions related to those constructs. We wanted an interview guide, again, that was semi-structured, meaning that you might have 10 questions, but when an interview guide is semi-structured, you don't necessarily have to ask them in that order. You might find that someone's veering toward answering number 4 after they answer number 1, and so you can go to number 4 and then go back to number 2. So you want to maintain that sort of sense of flowing through the guide, still covering the guide as thoroughly as possible, but not necessarily doing it in such a strict manner as to, ask question in every order in the same way every time. So that's that semi part of semi-structured. And we want interview guides to be brief and prioritized and targeted, but still have that flexibility. So if we think about usual practice, that construct, we might ask a question like, what types of screeners are currently used routinely? Just to get that sense of what are they already doing? What are they already familiar with? Relative advantage, how does this compare to other screeners? We know from diffusion of innovation that if people don't perceive what you're offering to be better or preferable to what they're already doing, they might be less likely to embrace it. And we had several questions about complexity and design because we were using the data to inform refinements to the tool. So we showed them the tool, we asked them what they thought about it, who they thought should complete it, when it should be done. So we really wanted a lot of information about that because that was our immediate purpose. Okay, so we're getting into rapid, and I'm gonna fly through this relatively quickly. Um, what happens when we get to the point of summarizing each interview, in this case, these were individual interviews, is that we want to create a template for that summary. And it's very helpful to do this in a table like you see here, because we can maintain that mapping back to the constructs from the framework that we're using. So what we develop for our templated summaries are domains that correspond to the interview guide questions. You'll see in most cases that the domain that I have on the right is not the same as the construct on the left. That's for me, I prefer not to use constructs from frameworks in our rapid analysis because not everyone on the team is necessarily familiar with the framework. They don't necessarily even need to be familiar with it. And I know that we can always map back to the framework later on, but you'll see in the comparison example later that some implementation scientists do use constructs from frameworks to drive their rapid analysis. So there are lots of options here. So we try to use words for the domain that are very closely tied to the question that was asked. So, for example, are the current screeners effective in identifying risk? And our domain is effectiveness of current screeners. That does map back to the evidence strength or quality of their current practices, but that language is not going to be quite as accessible as the language of the question. One other thing to note here is that, well, two other things. One is that you see there's mostly a one-to-one correspondence between the domain and the question, but for the questions about the tool itself, there's more than one domain. And that's because we really needed that breakdown of their response to the format and the content and who should complete it when it should be done to inform our refinements. And the other thing to point out is the idea of a neutral domain name. So one thing we often get into in our implementation evaluations is ideas about positive, negative, barrier, facilitator, valence. So what, is this a good thing, a bad thing, et cetera? And that does require a level of interpretation that we're trying to kind of suspend at this point in the process. Anytime we're looking at data and we're thinking, well, is that a barrier? And sometimes the facilitator is a flip side of a barrier. And anytime it kind of makes us need to really think through, do I call it positive? Do I call it negative? It's going to add a dimension to this that might slow you down. Would I say never do it? No, because it might really work for your team to do that. We try to avoid valences and tend more toward neutral domain names for this part of the process and then add in valence later. So it's a very simple, it's meant to be simple. This is not about coding. This is not about using special software. It's meant to be, it's meant to be straightforward. It's meant to be able to be done by people who are trained but have a variety of different backgrounds. We've done this with community members being involved in analysis. We've done this with uh, high school students, college students, all the way, like a whole spectrum of folks can get involved in this, which was one of my goals with the approach. So this is just done in Word, where we create this template, and you see I just move the domains into this template, this transcript summary, and then we're going to populate it with bullet points from the transcripts. We also include space for other observations at the end and potentially for important quotations. And there are some nuances there that I don't have time to get into, but this is one of those places where you can be really tailored to the needs and skill sets of your team. So this is the one piece of the process that I strongly recommend not skipping. You do want to take the template that you design and test it out with the team. Make sure that everyone understands how it's set up, how to use it, and make sure that people are using it in a relatively similar way. So I don't recommend just making a template and having everyone start summarizing without making sure that the template works. So you want to make sure the domains make sense, they are correctly labeled, that it's pretty easy to use, and that it doesn't take too long to complete it. I say it takes about an hour. That's for a a thoroughly done interview. Maybe it's about 30 to 45 minutes. The interview guide was used as intended. The questions are clear. It's not one of those interviews that goes off the rail, and we want to document what they talked about in response to each question. That's just a ballpark, and I'm not saying that it only takes an hour to analyze data, because that's gotten me in trouble before. So you really want to make sure when you're testing the template that the styles that the team are using are similar in terms of the volume of information. We do recommend using segments of quotations and also populating the template, even if there's no answer to the question, because as you'll see, when we use matrix analysis to have empty cells, and you'll see this better in a moment, will really create some confusion where we don't need confusion. You can also add notes like, this is the interview with lots of great data on this topic, or there are great quotes in this transcript, and we recommend putting in line numbers from the transcripts. So this is an example of a partially completed summary. Is after you've established consistency, you can divide up the transcripts across the team, and you'll see that in this case, we just pulled some points from the interview. For example, currently used screeners, just the one we have to use about whether they'll be homeless in 30 days. I'm going to put in the line number of where I can find that quote in the transcript. And you see other examples here as well. So good summaries are pretty brief. They're meant to be this accompaniment to the transcript. So about 2, maybe 3 pages. If they're getting really long, they stop being as useful as a quick overview of what's in the data. They're organized, of course, because they are templated. They should be thorough, and capture the main points that people made. And what I like to do is assess whether I have a good sense of what someone talked about after I read the summary. I will not know everything that they said because I'm not reading the transcript, but I should have a good sense of what they talked about. And it should be very useful in terms of providing pointers for what's in the transcript. This is just a set of instructions for you to have available in the slides. And then the next step, now you can get a lot of traction out of your individual summaries. And sometimes we do combined summaries of summaries. So there's so many innovations. I'm going to point a couple out to you in a few moments. But you can do a lot just with your summaries. What we typically do is the next step, which is transferring the summaries into matrices. And matrix analysis is a very tried and true data analysis approach with qualitative data. I didn't invent that either. It just happens to work really well with the summaries, the templated summaries. So you can set up the matrices tables, same thing, in ways that make sense for the purpose of your analysis. And matrix analysis is super helpful for starting to see patterns, starting to see trends. I have found that they're very useful for team-based discussions when you're bringing in more of the team, like maybe the quantitative team, maybe other people who weren't involved in the qualitative data. If you show people a table of these bullet points, it gives something for everyone to respond and react to and to see. And these are folks who are probably never going to read actual transcripts, which is fine because not everyone can do that and has the time to do that. And it isn't appropriate for everyone to read them. So this is an example of a matrix from the same project that just has a little bit more data in it. And so you see on the right, what we were really using for our immediate purposes was the response to the format. And we see pretty much at a glance that everyone likes that it's short, at least it's not long. People are concerned about the answers. What will we do if they say yes? What do we do with this and the one that they were already doing, the mandated one? And so we were able to act pretty quickly by working with our matrix analysis, sticking with, the length and then taking the next steps to clarify what's going to happen, with a positive screen, et cetera. So it gives us this sort of at a glance version of what's in the data, and then we can go back to the actual full set of data in the transcripts to get the context and get more information. So you can do these very creatively. I tend to do them in Word, which probably makes some people very uncomfortable because they do get big. A lot of people do them in Excel. Again, this is one of those things that you can really make your own. We have a new team member who has ridiculously good Excel skills and has figured out a whole way to even make me like Excel more than I usually do. So this is one of those things that you can decide how you want to set it up for, the best purposes for your team. So the matrix analysis really lets us to look at content in any given domain. It helps us to see what the variation is about the different topics that we're looking at. We can assess gaps in information. So what I mentioned earlier about having empty cells, if any cell here is blank, I'm not really going to know why it's blank. Did the person forget to fill it out? Did they not get asked the question? Did they get asked the question, but they didn't answer it? So it's very helpful to have something populating every bullet point, so that you're not wondering what happened once you're looking at your matrix. Um, really what the goal is for these processes is to get that quick, accessible understanding of what's in the data. We can use the summaries to inform phases of data collection. We can move from our domains back to the constructs in our theory model framework. There are hundreds of papers that have been published now using just the techniques that I showed you, and no coding was involved. It may be that you decide you want to code. And what's nice about having these resources, your summaries, your matrices, is that you will, I think, and what we found is you will have a much more informed way of approaching your coding approach. So you'll know, what do I need codes for? What do I want to pursue using coding, which is going to be a longer process, and it's going to require more specialized skills, and it's not always necessary for the products that we're trying to develop. I'm almost done, I promise. There are limitations. I mentioned that this is not well suited for unstructured data because it is aligned with the structure that you have in your data collection approach. And so if you have data collection approaches that don't involve structure, using structure to analyze them, it just isn't a good fit. I've tried it. It does not feel good, doesn't work well. And there are lots of other techniques that we can use analytically that are better suited to that type of data. One comparison paper that compared the approach I just shared with you to thematic analysis by Taylor and colleagues revealed that it was the rapid approach was better accomplished by people who are embedded in the settings where the implementation research is taking place. And that was a really interesting and helpful finding on their part. It is less reliant on quotations, but it doesn't mean that the quotations aren't important. It's more a matter of having that cross-referencing system to where the quotations are located. There can be variability in how the summaries are completed, which is why it's so important to do that test driving step. It's just critical, no matter how experienced you are, no matter how many times you've done this. Every new project I have, and I've been doing this now for over 10 years, we never skip that step. It's very important. It may not be sufficient for some journals, although it's just become more and more popular, or some version of what I've shared with you. And so we're just seeing generally less pushback as long as you explain really clearly what you did. And of course, because we're trying to do things rapidly, we might not be engaging with all of the data that's available, but that doesn't mean we never can. It just might mean we need to kind of delay some ways of engaging with the data until another time point and until we've achieved certain goals. I just want to draw your attention. I won't get into it just in the interest of time, but I want to draw your attention to a really helpful paper by my colleague Andrea Nevedal and others, including Laura Damschroeder, who developed CFAR, where they compared RAPID to a more framework-driven um, uh, manual coding approach. Very, very careful analysis, looking at the time spent, costs, and what they got out of both approaches. So they compared this coding to rapid using CFAR. So even that, if that's of interest to you, I just recommend this paper in general because it has so much insight into rapid and other analytic approaches. And it did show, as other comparative papers have shown, that rapid does save time. That is important, quite a bit of time. It reduced the analysis time by many hours, and they did find that both approaches met project goals, but that they were able to share results more quickly with partners using Rapid. And this is just a little bit more from that paper about their considerations. It's just extremely thoughtful. So if you're wanting to see, or maybe you're a little skeptical about, and I understand that, about this approach versus what we might think of more traditionally in terms of coding, it will give you a lot of ways of thinking about rapid and using a framework to drive the rapid approach, which I didn't get into today because it's not how I tend to do this work. And one of the key points here is just thinking about, when we use a framework to drive all components of our analyses, are we potentially kind of narrowing our lens too much so that we're not even necessarily seeing what doesn't fit that framework? So that's something just to think about, and how you're going to remain open as a team to more inductive and emergent discoveries. There are many recent advances. Just to touch on here, my colleagues and I, we have a rapid qualitative methods training hub in VA. Thanks to VA for supporting that. So our team wrote a consensus-based framework for planning for and assessing rigor in rapid qual. That just came out last year in implementation science, and then one of my implementation teams, we developed a more rapid approach to rapid in implementation work called the RIF, or the Rapid Implementation Feedback Report, where we were finding that even what I just shared with you for rapid approaches wasn't rapid enough and didn't give us quite what we needed to inform implementation planning and tailoring. So we we innovated and developed a reporting approach that we're really getting a lot of traction out of. So that's available as well, just published last year. And there are many, many other innovations. Um, and here are just some helpful references for Rapid, some papers that use it or that describe it. And even that cyber seminar I did over 10 years ago, it's now cited in, I think, like about 500 papers. So there's more and more. And I say that not to, bring anything to myself, but more to say that there is just more and more coming out that's using rapid techniques and that you can draw on for examples in your own work and see what kinds of things are working for you, what kinds of things do you want to adjust in your application of this so that it really is as useful as possible in your implementation work. So with that, I will wrap up and just give you my emails. There are a few extra slides at the end with some work that I had done in implementation of genetic services. So I'm going to just leave them in the slides. I won't go through them, but it's available here with papers that we wrote that describe how we used our qualitative data and our rapid analysis to inform the development of a survey. And that led to a bunch of other things in that project as well. So I'm going to stop there so we have a few minutes to chat, and then certainly happy to follow up and provide any additional resources that you might be interested in. Thank you
Great.
so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Allison. I have to say, I'm one of the groupies of the cyber seminar. I've watched it several times. A few years ago, I started using it in my work, and something I love about this technique of how just practical it is. And I think you summarized that well by saying, like, what did people say to inform what you want to do?
Yeah,
So I really thank you for going over so many gems. We will provide the slides. We will provide a recording of this as well. So for all of those who asked, and now we have time for a couple questions. I'm going to point us to the chat. First one came in from Melissa, who asked about what you would recommend doing for developing the templated summary in situations where the interviewee addresses a topic not tied to the original question or
yeah,
other inductive themes arising.
yeah. It's a really great question, Melissa. And we hope that that happens, right, with our qualitative data collection, is that this is part of why we do qualitative work, is to learn what we don't already know, to learn things, outside of our lens that will come up because of people's expertise and experiences, etc. What we typically do, and there are a couple different options here. What we typically do is have a section at the end of the template that is called something like other observations, or you can call it inductive observations. You can call it whatever you want. Along the lines of, here's something that doesn't have a clear place to park it, which might mean that it is more inductive, more emergent, less aligned with how we've set up the interview guide. But we don't want to ignore it. We don't want to, well, we would never throw it away because it's part of the data, but we don't want to miss the key point that someone made. So we'll make that point in other observations. I've seen some variability in terms of people's comfort level with that. People who are really well versed with qualitative methods and maybe other analytic techniques are like, I have to have that section because there's all these things that don't fit and I don't want to lose track of them. And people who are, in my experience, are a little bit newer to this are maybe a little bit more tentative about that. And they think, oh, well, if it doesn't fit, that must mean that I don't know how it fits, and they may second guess themselves. So it's something I would recommend really keeping an eye on if you have a section like that, talking with the team, periodically and regularly about what is falling into that other section. It might be that something is so recurring or relevant or interesting or all of the above that you actually want to create a more emergent domain to add to the template, because you're starting to see it. It's something that, like, I'll give a quick example, which I think maybe helps, because in the work on genetic services, one of the things that we did not intentionally ask about was the issue of clinical utility. And what we heard in interviews was people saying, well, if I don't know, providers, this is physicians saying, if I don't know how I would use the result of a genetic test, I'm not going to order it because I don't know why it would be useful to me. And this was a bit of a surprise, especially for the clinical geneticist who was the PI of the project. She was like, how do they not know how you would use this? But that's not the point, right? The point is that people didn't know how they would use the results. And that wasn't one of our original domains because we didn't have a specific question about it. We started to see and hear as we were collecting data, this keeps coming up. We're getting really interested in it. We actually want to create a domain about it. At first, it showed up in other observations, and then we were like, this is becoming so interesting and so common, so prevalent that we actually want to build in another domain. And yes, then we did go back to interviews that we had already summarized to make sure that we captured it. So it kind of depends what you do with it. Those more emergent discoveries kind of depends on if they're one-off, two-off things that people say that you just want to keep track of, or if you're starting to see a more emergent theme that you then would want to build into your summarizing process.
Great. Thanks so much. And I think we probably don't have time unless you can do it very quickly. So I'm going to end us here and have people contact you for additional questions. You can also make consultations with the IS Core through the CFAR. I'm putting the link in the chat. And her vet is putting in a document where you can sign up more for these methods focused IS series. And once again, Dr. Hamilton, thank you so, so much for your time. And we appreciate you and all the work you've added to the field. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'll put some references, I'll add some references in the slides about rapid ethnography because it's one of my most favorite topics. So
Great.
just to answer that question, I'll add to the slides before I send you the final version.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Good luck
Bye.
with your work. Bye. Thank you.